Writing this became a community project, and it was all done during the COVID lockdown. I loved having a project. Judy Furness, who was the historian of the town of Ledyard, and Linda Kabalak, her assistant, were so generous with their ideas and encouragement and their materials. Dr. Linda Schwab, historian of the village of Aurora, read the initial draft and made suggestions. Ann Matheson was Styles and Stories' stellar editor, and the book's historic photographs were supplied by Rob. Sorry about that. Rob LoMascolo, and they were taken from his copies from Bill Heck's collection. Michaela Groth, our technical guru, helped put this program together. Now, I'm going to be presenting samples from the book in chronological order. But first, there's some background. Because Aurora's earliest homes are relative newcomers. Fire pit stones were carbon dated. These came from our shore, carbon dated to be 10,000 years old. And they were left by Stone Age hunters and gatherers who, visiting here, probably were as awed as we are by the sunsets on the lake. We know more about the Iroquois, the last of the native people who loved this land. The Cubist villages with their longhouses, spaced along the sides of our lake, were destroyed during the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. On the site of Aurora, Shonendote, Peachtown, with its great orchards of apple trees and peach trees, as well as partially harvested crops of corn and many, many other vegetables, were all destroyed on December 29th, 1779. The Cubists fled toward Canada and to Niagara Falls to the protection of the village of the British. But in the awful winter that followed, many did not survive. Then known as the Military Tract, and comprising well over 1.5 million acres, this former Iroquois land was surveyed and divided into 600-acre lots. The former Iroquois land was awarded by lottery to former Revolutionary soldiers as payment for their service. Many came to settle, but more sold their land. And land speculation was big business. Lawyers were needed to manage the sales and settle frequent disputes. Many congregated in Aurora, which was central to the military tract. Good schools were created. Schools have been important to the people of this village since the beginning. Many people from New England, friends, with their eyes on commerce, arrived too. And they valued education, and they brought with them strong beliefs of tolerance and temperance and opportunities for women. And then came the houses. This is a drawing of the Captain Roswell Franklin cabin, which was built in 1789 and was the first here. 19 men arrived. They'd come from within a 50-mile radius to spend 2 days building this. Professor Temple Holcroft explained how this all worked. The frame for each part of the building was fastened together while it was lying on the ground, with its foot on the part of the foundation on which it was to stand. Then liquor was brought to bear on the problem of raising the frame. When the normal strength of the men had been properly augmented by that of the liquor, the frame went up like magic, and it was fastened into position by the carpenters. Now, two early homes, these are early styles of homes, were common in New England and common here at the beginning in the village. The salt box is the older, and you can see it's a story and a half. It's three to 5 bays wide, and a bay is a section that has a window or a door. So both of these are 5-bay houses. The long roof at the back was called a cat slide, and it was great because snow slid right off. And the storage area was in the back of the house, and it acted as insulation as well. This would have been on a stone foundation, was simple to build. People knew how to build them, and they were good first homes. The Cape Cod was developed on Cape Cod to withstand the winters there, and the winters here were no treasure. It was usually 1.5 stories high, commonly 5 bays wide, and had the large central chimney, was comfortable for a family, and the solid shutters on both of these houses were for protection. This was not decoration, this was protection, and to keep the wind away. These would have been commonly built in Aurora, but they also were built around in the countryside. And you will see some of these as you drive around Aurora, out in the country, you'll see some of these old ones. The ones in the village, for the most part, were replaced with something grander as soon as they could do it. Now, the Patrick Tavern, Aurora's oldest remaining structure, was built in 1793. It's a very heavy square building with wide plank floors and deep window and door casings. It was built to last. The building then stood in the middle of the business district. The business district has moved north, but the tavern has not. And currently, this is the home of the very busy order in and take out farmers market. I want you to appreciate that this is the only picture that has people in it. Because when I took these pictures, there was no one. Everyone was at home. There was no traffic. I could stand in the middle of the street for 5 minutes, waiting until the light was what I wanted. These are the only people, and I bet you recognize who they are. Now, the Chimney Corner was built in 1806 to be a meeting place for the Masons of Scipio Lodge 68. It's the oldest building in the state of New York, built by the Masons, and it's on the State Historic Register. I want you to notice the width of the fireplace on the left, and also the fact that they're so simply decorated. That's Federal style. The smaller fireplace is in a different room, and see how simple the staircase is. Simple and beautiful, as is the door and the door frame behind it. In 1822, the Scipio Lodge 68 Masons joined with the Royal Arch Masons to build the existing Masonic Temple. Their former building became a private residence. Twice it was a tea room, and it was in one of those incarnations that it was given its name, the Chimney Corner. Jethro Wood, who developed the cast iron plow, was the first owner of this fine Federal style house. And here I want to explain Federal style. These are Georgian homes, and the late Georgian, these had been popular in England and the colonies for about 300 years in England. They had a stone foundation. The long side faces the street. They're 2 stories high, 5 or more bays wide, and usually had one central hall with 4 rooms on each floor. There was one central room, one central chimney or 2 end chimneys. Shutters were more decorative than for protection, and the doorway was important. But in England and the colonies, the late Georgians became very, very heavily decorated. The more they could get on, the better. After the Revolution, Americans wanted nothing to do with England, and they stripped the decorations off their houses. So we had doorways that could have a fan, it's called a fan light above it, or perhaps an eagle. It had side lights, and side lights are windows either side of the door. That was acceptable. We could have those. The smooth facade was often painted cream or white, and it had dark shutters and large double hung windows, usually with 6 panes of glass in each window. Building with windows was expensive, and usually you couldn't get bigger panes than the small ones. Now you see here we've got a window in the Jethro Wood house. The new owners were so gracious to make these photographs for us so that we could use them. And I want you to see the front door over here on the left. It has its side lights, it has transom lights above it, but you notice there's no decoration in that door. It's very plain, very pleasant to look at. There's the house again, the exterior, handsome, handsome house. All symmetrical. Inside, the staircase, like the one in the chimney corner, is very simple. It's very appealing. It's almost contemporary. Beautiful, beautiful woodwork. And the fireplace with its carving, here's the sunburst design. The sunburst was representative of this new way of having government. It was patriotic. You learn a lot from a house's basement. You can tell roughly when it was built, where additions were put on, and you can see the woodworking that was done on this. One of the beams is slightly dressed, would have been done with an adze, and other beams are tree trunks. That was early building. We have other very fine federal houses in the village. The Christopher Morgan House, built in 1805, has the fan light in the dormer. Take a look at that. Central chimney, pilasters in the front with a little bit of Greek coming in, but certainly it's simple. This house, the Jedediah Morgan House, now has a porch that runs the length of the whole building, but you still can see those federal characteristics, the door with its side lights and the arch pilasters and the chimney. Look at the number of chimneys on this house. The manse, again, it has the fan light above the central window, very symmetrical. Great story with this one. It's undocumented, but even when Doug Wood was doing remodeling, I asked him if he could see where the second house had been added to the back. And he said he could. It was only a few bolts, but they had held. Apparently, a house was brought across the lake on the ice to be added to the back of this house to give it more space. And the beautiful Riford House. But again, see 2 fan lights on this one. We have the side lights and the transom lights, double chimneys, symmetry, easy to look at. Beautiful, beautiful building. And we have the Peter Fort House. Again, it's symmetrical. I find these extremely beautiful. The porch was added early in the 20th century against the wishes of the professor who was living there, because he feared that it was going to destroy the federal look. You still can see the parts, but that's an add-on. And now we're down to the Peter Otis house that was built in 1824, and this has a wonderful story. Again, it has the wonderful doorway. There's a lot of symmetry here. This is a brick. It's a little bit unusual for the federal style, a little bit changed, but here's the tale. The lime for the mortar was burned in lime kiln gully on the property. The bricks used in the house and the outbuildings were made in brick kiln field, also on the farm. Limestone for the foundation was quarried in King Ferry, about 4 miles south of this site. The lumber that eventually found its way into this house, all virgin white pine, came from a forest in Schuyler County. That's between the southern ends of Cayuga and Seneca Lakes. It was hauled to Ithaca, loaded on a barge, and was headed north behind a steamboat to some unknown market when the barge broke loose in a storm and washed ashore at Rocky Point, 2 miles to the north. Carter, after paying $100, retrieved the cargo and with a yoke of oxen drew the lumber to his house site where it provided all the lumber needed for his home. Love it. Now the wood carving in the interior was done by a local craftsman who spent one whole winter carving the parlor woodwork. And at that point, there were books that showed pictures like this one of potential beautiful woodwork and gave slight directions in how to do it. Now, the Howland Stone Store Museum was built in 1837, and it's included here not only because it's a fine little 3-bay fieldstone, cobblestone building, but because it was built for Slocum Howland, one of the many friends in Sherwood and an important abolitionist. He owned many wagons and boats because of his mercantile business. And in these wagons and boats, he transported people moving to the Canadian border. The stone store has been restored and it's open often, particularly in the summer, to the public. Now, in the building next door, there are these wonderful locks on the doors, and I just had to show these to you. These were common at that time. Now, the Greek Revival style became very popular nationwide between 1815 and 1840. Americans became increasingly enamored with everything Greek, and the style had massive columns. You can see them there, and it was symmetrical. It had heavy cornices beneath the roof, and generally a porch across the front. Its short side faced the street, and that made it a very popular style in the cities. And it was used for public buildings as well as homes. We have many wonderful Greek Revival styles up in the country as well as here in the village. But the one here in the village, Taylor House, it has all the Greek hallmarks, but it is bigger than life. I think it was designed so that it could be admired from people in the steamboats who were going up and down the lake. It just is so massive. Here we have it in all its glory with its heavy columns, Doric Greek columns, the cornices beneath the roof, very slanting mansard roof, which does not show in this picture. Good porch all across the front, lovely lions. And if you take a look at the door, it has transom lights as well as side lights. And also notice the large panes of glass in these windows. Impressive. Now take a look at the domed dining room. This was added in 1870 and was a replica of a Florentine palace. Its builder was Samuel D. Mandell of Aurora. But I want you to take a good look too at not only the ceiling, but the floor. Look at that parquet floor. Is that not magnificent? Following the Greek Revival style, Gothic architecture became the exciting new style. If one had spacious lawns on which to plant these Gothic castles, this was not for a narrow city lot. Do you see? We've got the gables, we've got, it's called tracery, or we call it gingerbread, underneath the eaves. And that was, they could do that then because the scroll saws had been just developed. And so carpenters were excited to be able to do this fancy woodwork. If they're built with wood, they're called carpenter Gothic, but we have one built with cobblestones, and it possibly is the only one that exists anywhere. Now, this is the VanBuskirk House, and you can see it has these wonderful, wonderful pointed arches in the windows as well. We have softer points in the door windows. Fancy railings, but not the tracery around the pointed peaks. We have twin fireplaces here, and these are amazing stones. And Gregory VanBuskirk was a former owner, and he remembered playing with the sorting boards when he was a little boy. Obviously, the boards had different sized holes, and you dropped the stones through so that you could have matching stones. And it's wonderful there. If you take a look at the house itself, the finest of the stones are close to the front door. And as you get around to the back of the house, they become more irregular. They were using the lesser stones where they didn't show. And in some rather secret spots, there are pieces of limestone worked into it. They kind of run out. The interior doors and windows have straight arched points. The molding is simple and repeats itself. There's a secret staircase in this house that twists up behind a rather unassuming looking library door. And this is the parlor bay window, new. It's over 100 years old, but that was added on. It's a wonderful house. Down here in the basement, you see the foundation for a very, very heavy house. All the beams are massive, the stone walls are thick, and it supports a tremendous amount of weight. 1845. 12 years after the VanBuskirk House was completed, Pettibone House, another wonderful Gothic example, was built. And here you have the splendid tracery beneath these peaks. That shows off, this is just a wonderful example. It may have been the first building in Aurora to come from a pattern book. The first architectural book, titled The Architect, came out, published in New York City, and it came out the year before this was built. And there is one that is definitely, there's some variations, but it is this house. The peaks are the primary feature. Take a look here. The peaks are also on the interior, and see them in the dining room over here. And take a look at that wonderful lighting fixture and the ornamental plaster work on the ceilings. Now, I have to take a moment and talk to you about the builders here in Aurora because I'm so impressed with what they've done. The Mandells, father and son, were Aurora's early master builders. Both were named Samuel, and they lived in the same piece of village land, or on it, for most of their lives. Samuel, the father, was a native of New Bedford, Massachusetts, came with his wife, Rhoda Pierce, to Aurora in 1812. He was 24 years old. Buildings were being replaced and moved and attached to each other. New construction was booming. The Mandell couple added 2 buildings together to make their own home on the site of the current Mandell House. Now, most of his buildings, the father's buildings, have been replaced. But here's one grand one that has not. This Leffingwell House, built for the Burnhams. He was a lawyer. Built in 1817. It was the first brick house in Aurora. The bricks were made at Carr's Cove, 4 miles north on the lake. The limestone came from the quarries in Union Springs. Take a look at the doorway in this building. It's got a federal doorway, although it's a bit of a mix architecturally. But this is the Father Samuel Mandell's masterpiece that is left here in the village. A few years later, 1845, he built the law office across the street using the same materials. We know this is Jane Morgan's little house, and everyone appreciates its very quiet beauty. Now, Samuel D. Mandell was the youngest son and the namesake of his father. He was educated at the Aurora Academy and apprenticed with his father and studied architecture for 1 year in New York. He worked away 2 years in Kentucky and California until he received a letter from his father telling him to come home, urging him to come home because there was good work here in Aurora. He never left after he came back. Like his father, he was an active Mason, was a member of the Presbyterian Council for years, sang in its choir. He quickly became Aurora's master builder. Now, the area's master mason was Martin Maloney, who came to Aurora in 1857 to work on the Christopher Morgan House. He had immigrated from Tipperary, Ireland in 1850 to house his growing family. He bought a double lot on Court Street from the Morgans and built a house still home to a descendant. Mr. Maloney kept meticulous records, and that shows that he and his sons worked on almost all of the buildings that are still in existence here in the village during the latter half of the 19th century. He was a member of the first vestry of St. Patrick's Church. Now, Henry Wells of Wells Fargo and Wells College fame often took a steamboat to Ithaca, and he would always point out to anyone who was there to listen that he was going to build a house right there on part of John Morgan's farm. But his house, Glen Park, was built where he envisioned it. And it's a fine example of the then new Italianate style. Now, we have 2 different varieties of Italianate in this part of our world. The more common is the cube with a cupola on top. And we see this up through the country. We see a wonderful brick one in Union Springs. This was the popular one. The more elaborate ones are like Glen Park, or like this example over here in this little drawing. It has a porte cochere, and it has arches, and it has many add-ons. Often they too will have a cupola, not in this drawing though. But keep an eye out for these. Now, the building was almost done with Glen Park, but the builder had left the circular staircase because it was a tremendous challenge to go up through 4 stories. And when Samuel Mandell came back to Aurora, he was invited to come in. He came at the right time, and he was invited to come in for consultation. And he knew what the mathematical formula was to create this, and consequently did this, and he oversaw this amazing staircase, and that completed the building. And that really set him up for the reputation that he always maintained. Now, Glen Park is such a wonderful building. Its exterior walls are blue limestone. Its interior walls are brick lined. Inside, they're lath and plaster. The fireplaces are marble. Nothing was spared in this house. It's grand, and yet it is comfortable. All of the interior windows have their own shutters, which unfortunately I didn't get a picture of here. You can see the doorway has its side lights, has transom lights. The floor was very contemporary for this time with the tiles. And again, we have wonderful ceiling fixtures and beautiful, beautiful plaster work. I want to go back to this because everything in Glen Park is well done, so tasteful, and so comfortable. Now, in 1860, the Presbyterian Church was built. It had a predecessor over here, a wooden church that was built in 1818. And the common story was that it had burned, but that was not true. It was taken apart because these were thrifty people all through the village. You did not waste lumber. You did not rip something apart and just discard it. You used it over again. And the parts of the original church were sold to help finance the church that we know now. The steeple and the bell tower were added in 1864. But I have to tell you this story. Okay, here we are. The bricks came from Union Springs, the limestone came from Union Springs, but the windows, which are baked painted glass, were made in Buffalo. It is at a gallery studio there. And it took forever. And there's a lot of communication still that we have in the files of where are the windows. And the windows arrived in Aurora the day before the church was to be consecrated. And this was causing a great deal of angst. But they came in on the steamer Aurora and pulled into a dock down here. The men of the village carried them to the church and installed them the night before the church was to be consecrated. That is such a wonderful picture in my mind. Apparently there was a full moon, so they had light. St. Patrick's Church was built in 1874. And it was built by Samuel Mandell, who had also worked on the Presbyterian Church. He and Martin Maloney used plans taken from a book, Working Designs for 10 Catholic Churches, and that was chosen by the Bishop of Rochester, the Right Reverend Bernard J. McQuaid. He laid the cornerstone and returned to dedicate the completed building. Now, this Italianate church sits so comfortably on its own little knoll, and it has a wonderful, peaceful interior that always makes me think of a spring night on the lake. It's just a treasure. And then we come to the Queen Anne style of architecture. They'd learned to get away from the square buildings. It's called balloon framing. You could have any footprint that you wanted. And the Queen Anne, it can include anything. It has turrets, it has fancy shingles, there are lots of spindles, there are groups of windows, sometimes they're edged with colored glass. Anything could go. And so in 1888, Samuel Mandell built a house for his family on the same piece of land that he'd grown up on. And you see, we have this fine woodwork across the front of the house. It's a little hidden by trees, so we'll take a look at it now. Here we have it in its new incarnation. Again, you can see the interesting exterior. It's been purchased by two builders who are architect builders, as was Samuel Mandell. And it's being dressed for a new life. Let me show you some interior. The fireplaces are edged with European tiles. There are many of these small fireplaces. The windows are edged with colored glass, and when the sun is right, rainbows play on the floor. Again, we've got a nice bay window over here, and another of the fireplaces with the beautiful tiles. And then we move to the Tudor. Now this is a heavy style of architecture. The World's Fair had been in this country, and in order to have buildings for it, a contest went out to architects to see who could design buildings for each country and for the states of the United States. College campuses picked up on this, and you go to some of the older schools and you'll see these Tudor buildings. And this is ours. The Aurora Free Library, Morgan Opera House, given to the village by Louise Morgan Zabriskie. And it has all of the Tudor characteristics. It has the half timber, it has the groups of windows, it has all of these wonderful gables. It's got it all. And inside we have the opera house upstairs with its raked stage, which is very special. Performers all identify it and think it's wonderful. Downstairs, where I am right now, is the library. And in the basement is the beginnings of a all-purpose room where the jail used to be. The bars are still on the windows. It's grand. I took all of this text and pictures to Rob LoMascolo and asked him if he could make it into a book. With our masks, we sat on my porch a long distance away from each other, because at that time, nobody knew how this awful disease was contacted. Rob took it, and he's going to take it now and show you what he did with what I gave him to come up with this truly very beautiful book. Thank you so much.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the presentation, and I want to thank the library for hosting us, and thank Claire for working with me on this project. This was a lot of fun. It's always nice to have a client that you really enjoy working with and work on a project that you really feel that you can add to and enjoy being part of. So this is the print shop. Many of you have probably visited at one time or another. It's up on Moonshine Road, the corner of Moonshine Road and Route 90. So it's just about a mile up the hill heading south. If you'd like to come visit the shop, you're welcome to do so. It's by appointment, unless you see my car outside. I'm normally there working in the afternoons, but sometimes in the morning, but it varies from day to day. So if you'd like to come visit, just send an email the day before and let me know, and I'd love to host you. So this is inside. You've seen this picture, a little preview of it in Claire's presentation. So mostly what you're going to see in the shop are actually antique printing presses. And unfortunately for this project, those presses weren't used. This book, because of the colored photos, we needed to print it using a digital process. But still, I thought I'd show this picture so you can see a lot of the machines that I use. They date from late 1800s, and they go all the way up to the mid 1960s when this kind of technology began to become obsolete. So if you're not familiar with letterpress printing, this is essentially the traditional method of printing that was developed over 500 years ago. And most of these machines in my shop really date from the turn of the last century. And they're all very heavy, and they all had to be found and restored. So if you'd like to come sometime, I'll be happy to give you more of a tour. One of the best things about the shop is actually just being in Aurora and my wonderful neighbors. And this is my friend Bunny. So in the summertime when the doors open, I'll be standing at the press working, and the bunny will come and visit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of how you come up with a book. So most people, when they start thinking about a book, they think about probably more about the content. But as a bookbinder and a designer and a printer, I'm more concerned with the structure and how the book's going to look and function. Oftentimes when people want to do a book, they unfortunately think of the binding of the book last. But I think it's good to think about that from the very beginning. In the case with Claire's book, the size of the book was really dictated by the size of the paper that we could print on, because it's all 8.5 by 11 paper that we folded down and then cut to a convenient size that you could carry the book around if you wanted to actually walk through Aurora and use it as sort of a guide to the houses. So these books here are actually all different styles of sewing. So most of us, when we look at a book, we probably don't really know or even think about what's underneath the cover. So these are all different structural methods of holding those pages together. Of course, these are all sewn books. Many books are just glued together, but these are just a variety of ways that books can be put together. If you notice the one all the way to the right, it has these sort of fuzzy cords going across the spine, and they form 3 bumps. If you've seen older books that have those bumps on the leather spine, that's actually what that is. That's the structural sewing of the book that actually is showing on the front. So here's an example of a book like that I bound, and it's got the leather going over those cords. In this case, a few more cords, this little bit larger book. So as nice as it would be to have done all the books in this kind of binding, we had to think about the market, where is this book going to be used, and how can we make the book affordable? Binding like this is a beautiful thing, but most leather books just sit on shelves and they don't get handled. So we wanted to make a book that would be handled and used by people. So how does it start? Well, this is what Claire sent me after we talked a little bit about doing this project. I think, like many projects, it ballooned considerably in scope from when we had first started. But this is just a Word document, and you can see that Claire has typed out what she wanted. This is the part at the beginning of the book that actually accompanies those beautiful drawings of the different styles that Claire did. And if you notice those drawings in the last presentation, those were all done by Claire. So Those were really, really nice. So if you're thinking about doing a book, the best thing to do is to just type it up as simply as possible. A lot of times, clients will try to design the book before they take it to a designer, and that's usually not very helpful. The professional designers aren't actually using programs like Microsoft Word. We're using some of the Adobe programs and other things like that. So if you've gone through and stuck in the drop caps or something like that in Word, that's just going to cause all kinds of compatibility issues later on. So just keep it very simple and, discuss with the person you're working with or with me what you'd like to do. So I think part of the temptation, especially with modern technology, is to say, well, I don't really need a book designer or someone to help me with the layout of this book. I have a computer, so I can do everything myself. And the same is true of, Home Depot has everything you need to build your house, but maybe you shouldn't or don't want to do your own electrical or your own plumbing or your own roofing. So maybe you would be well served by having a professional work on the design and the layout of your book as well. They can do it more quickly and probably better. So here I just have a little comparison. On the left side, if you just sort of use the default settings that the computer would come up with, you get something like that. The typeface that's used is Helvetica, which I'm sure some of you out there love that typeface, but it's one that kind of irks me. It was really designed not to show emotion or to be connected to a particular time period or place. And by doing so, it really feels a bit dated to me. Of course, if you do want to use it, you'll be in good company with companies like Walmart, places like that. On the right side, we have what is the title page of the actual book. And you can see that there's, it's not too many typefaces being used. We have a sort of large italic for the title, which is a little unusual. And then we have a line of capitals, and then they look essentially like capitals at the bottom, but they're actually small caps, which are smaller versions of the capital letters. And these are the sorts of things that designers would have access to on their computers with their software. And this particular typeface is called Bell. It was developed in the late 1700s. And I just think it's a really elegant typeface that you just don't see that often, and just feels right for Aurora. It's a little quirky, but yeah, quite traditional. So this is Adobe InDesign. This is the program that I use for all my layout and design work. You can see the blue and the pink or purplish lines. These are all guidelines that don't actually print. They just help me decide where things have to go. You can see the pictures have been placed. And I have to give Claire credit for taking a lot of wonderful pictures for this book. The color photos were mostly taken, I believe, on your cell phone. So they look very, very good. And with very few exceptions, where I did a little bit of tweaking, they were pretty much ready to go in the book. So this is one of the images that I get a lot of comments on that's in the book. This is actually the end sheets in the book. And this is something that I had. This print, many of you familiar with Aurora have probably seen this print. It's a pretty popular print. It's dated 1848, although it was published in the documentary history of New York, and that was published around 1850. It's kind of a strange image to be part of that book because it's not listed in the index. And the only reason I can think it's really in there is because the book was overseen by Christopher Morgan, who was Secretary of State of New York State at the time. So he had an Aurora connection. There are so many copies of this print around, though. I think it must have been published elsewhere as well as this book. So if anyone knows, let me know. I'd love to know more about this print. I've collected a number of copies of them, and the fold marks are not always the same either. So it must have been published in more than one place. But regardless, this is a hand-colored version of that print that I found on eBay, actually. And that made it into the book. So many of the other historic images that are in the book, we have to thank Bill Hecht for. If you know Bill Hecht, he's a all-around do-gooder. And Bill's passion is, or one of his passions is collecting and scanning and making available historic images of this area. So Union Springs, Aurora, Cayuga, and the surrounding area. So the best way, if you want to see some of Bill's pictures or get in contact with him, is to look him up on Facebook. Just search for Bill Hecht, and you'll start to see some of his pictures. We do post a lot of Bill Hecht's photos on the Frontenac Historical Society page as well, and they'll pretty much pop up everywhere. So a big thank you to Bill Hecht for making those images available. So once the book is printed, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this because I think most of you are familiar with how a digital printer works, which is how this book was done. Claire and I worked together to pick a nice cream colored paper, and then it was digitally printed. And then binding is really all about hand tools. So you can see these two white stick type things laying on top of this. And this is kind of a fancy book with this marbled end sheet in it. Those are folders. Those are hand tools used for folding paper. And up in the upper left, there's a container of glue and a foam brush. So these are kind of your basic tools for putting books together. I'm sorry to disappoint you. There's no magical process to it. It's mostly just handwork, a process that goes back, or a craft that goes back hundreds of years. So one of the few big mechanical machines used in producing books is a paper cutter. So this is the paper cutter in the shop, the guillotine style cutter. So if you notice, a lot of books have really clean edges that have been cut. So this machine is how that's done. It's able to cut a whole stack of paper at a time. So the books were actually cut to final size after they were assembled. So this is what the book looks like if you haven't seen it. It's available at the Village Market here in Aurora, or you can take out a copy from the library. And one of the other nice features of this book that I really liked working on is in the bottom of this image, you can actually see there's a fold-out map. And Claire and I went back and forth a little bit about how to get a map in this small format book where you could actually read and discern where all the different things were. So Claire did a really nice watercolor painting that was, I think, maybe a little bit of a painful process to do, but it came out really, really nice. And then I scanned that into the computer and put all the labels on them, on the text. And here we are talking about the finished book. If you want to find out more about my work or ask questions, the best way to do is to look up my website, which is rlfinepress.com, or you can Google Robert LoMascolo and I'll come right up. Again, if you'd like to come out and visit the shop and see some of the antique machines and how books are put together, I certainly would enjoy that and welcome you to do that. Just let me know in advance when you'd like to come and I'll try to accommodate you. So thank you very much.
The first question that we had was about the Morgan House. And I was asking if Abijah Morgan who was hired to build the Morgan House, was he a relative of the Morgans?
They were cousins. They were, I don't know if they were first cousins or perhaps second cousins. And they both came in here about the same time. And Jedediah Morgan, in his own right, was very influential in the community. His son, Lewis, is the one who is the known to be father of anthropology. He truly is more well-known than the father. He was a lawyer in Rochester, but studied the Iroquois. He'd been fascinated by the Iroquois all his life and wrote the anthology that is still known to be the greatest source for Iroquois history.
Let's see, there was also the question of how long was the process from the time of that Claire first got the decision to do the research till the time she got in touch with Rob and the final product? How long did it take you to put it all together?
I started in March and the book came out in August. So that was it. And it helped that I didn't have all that much else to do.
Oh, Abijah Morehouse. I'm sorry.
Ah.
That's the not Morgan. Abijah Morehouse.
Oh.
Is that a relation to you? I guess
He was a builder. The Morehouses came in very early to Seneca Falls. They were big families. He's not in David's direct line, but I'm sure he was part of that family.
Thanks for clearing that up for me. Did anyone else have any questions? Oh, is there a volume 2 in the future?
There is. There is. It's just
Excellent.
It's born. It's very exciting. Its name is Beginnings. And I've spent a lot of time studying glaciers. Let you know, I wanted it to come out this summer, but that's not going to happen. So it's going to be ready for next summer. Once I get off the glaciers.
Okay.
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment for Claire, my old friend. Can you hear me?
Great to see you.
Good to see you too. I was so amused when you were talking about some of the characteristics of old homes because not that I recognize a lot of names on here, but many of you know that I lived in what I always called the Avery Sisters house. And in the cellar, you could see the log timbers that held the structure. And I've always been told that the south end of the house that's closest to Chimney Corner was actually a log cabin that was built in 1798, 99. And when I spent my first freezing cold winter in that house because it had no insulation, and we hired a company to, burr a hole and blow insulation in, they couldn't do that end of the house because it kept hitting the original logs that had been covered by the clapboard.
Oh my.
Yeah, so that was, and also the colored windows that you talked about. There was one in the bathroom of all places, but it made a lovely morning rainbow on the floor.
But Cindy, I'd always heard that end of the building was a log cabin, and I never heard that it was replaced. So it just simply was incorporated into the building that stands now. Am I correct?
Well, that's my understanding. there used to be, you may remember, the little jut out with the lattice sides.
Yes.
That was a well. And the house just grew from there more and more. And I've been told that the far north end, which was originally my dining room, was actually a separate building, like you mentioned, you know, somebody gets it from someplace else and slides it up
Yep.
against a house, and that it was Ebenezer, I'm losing my mind, married Lydia, and Ebenezer Arms, law office and the village post office, and it had its separate entrance, which was later incorporated into the kitchen. So it's just another example of the great work that you've done to show how the houses started like this and then went like this.
Yes, they grew and they grew and they grew, and they
Yeah,
didn't waste any of the material. But when you think how hard they'd work to get those planks, you couldn't go to Home Depot and get some more.
no.
Trees
But
are-
I so enjoyed this book and this presentation, and I thank you for all your work.
Well, we thank you for what you've done too, Cindy.
Oh.
We're excited about that one.
Cindy, ever get that?
Thank you.
Yep.
I just might add, for Cindy's benefit, we're at 425 Main, now the late Georgian or early Federal that Claire highlighted. And when our contractors drilled in the walls to blow in insulation in the front part of the house, which is post and beam, if you can believe it, they found bricks. And when we researched that, we discovered that that was I guess a form of insulation, but it's called nogging, Nogging. So the front portion of the house, it does a credible job, is nogged. It does a credible job of holding in the heat in the winter and the coolness in the summer. But there's no getting any blown in insulation in there. So we're double layers when you come to 425 Main. So the back is different. It's 50 years later and it's balloon construction on a beautiful limestone foundation. The front is on essentially stone in a crawl space that's, well, the beams occupy about half of the crawl space, and the beams are massive. And as Claire said, some of them are raw or the live edges, and only the edges that needed to bear were adzed in place. Massive beams running the entire length, east to west on the house. Okay.
Oh,
Sorry
I'd
about
like
that.
to see them.
Well, bring your blue jeans and we'll crawl around in the crawl space.
Okay. What fun.
Okay.
There was a question, how often, or let's see, do you have any sense of how often the moving of the houses was done? Must have been hard to do in the days without diesel tractors.
No, I don't. But I know that it was not infrequent. I don't imagine it was an event. I think it was common enough that people just said, oh yeah, they're doing that again. And a lot of the smaller houses, and they're not all small either. Doc Thoburn's house was moved from the northern end of the village down to where it is in its totality. And that's not a small house. And it's up on a rise. And they had horses and oxen to do this. I marvel.